We've been talking about the Antichrist. Who is he, what he will do, and when he will do it. So we want to be clear exactly what the biblical data is, what he does. But then also the timeline is important as well in terms of when he will do those things. In terms of his identity, remember he is a resurrected man who will return to earth in the end times. He lived prior to the time that John wrote Revelation. He is a Westerner. Common suggestions as to his identity then and who lived in the past, the Roman Emperor Nero, or the Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes, or Judas Iscariot. I lean toward Antiochus Epiphanes as the best choice or option. Talking with Rusty, was it, I guess, last week or maybe the time before, but looking at these faces and saying, well, I wonder if there is anybody in the world today that looks like these characters. I thought, Justin Trudeau does kind of favor Nero, and he does kind of favor Antiochus, so it's like, he would be a good candidate for either one of those guys. So I'm not saying that he is, the Antichrist, but it's like, it kind of works, it's close.
I never thought there was Google facial recognitions.
Well, that would be interesting to go through that, go through a bunch of people's faces. But just doing that would kind of give you a sense of what the Antichrist would look like, as somebody from the past coming to the present day, where he's no longer wearing a toga, and a laurel wreath, but instead a coat and tie, just to kind of see him transformed. It's just kind of interesting. So anyway, I just kind of played around with that, but it is kind of interesting. He does a little bit favor these characters. So especially, as I said, if you were to do his hair, in Roman style or Greek style, put the little headband on there, like, like I said, I'm not saying that he is the one, but it is interesting.
Which one is Matt? The one from France and the one from Canada?
Macron in France, but I think he looks more like these characters than Macron does. Macron had more of a traditional French look to him. Anyhow, then moving on, we talk about his rise to power. Remember, begins when he signs a covenant with the Jewish nation. That is actually when the 7-year tribulation begins. The clock starts counting when he signs the covenant. And so in the first half, he's grabbing power. He is the rider on the white horse, Revelation 6, when we have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So he would be one of those horsemen. He creates a 10-nation confederation. So these nations stand with him, and they are his real power base. And he maintains a working relationship with Mystery Babylon, which we'll talk more about going forward, Lord willing. Then the zenith of his power then would be achieved at the midpoint and then is maintained through the second half of the tribulation period. So a series of events are introduced to us in the middle of Revelation at the midpoint of the tribulation period, because they are initiated then, but then they'll continue on through the 3.5 years. But at the midpoint, he invades Israel, so he breaks the covenant that he made with them as he invades. Secondly, he then moves his capital to Jerusalem. It was presumably somewhere in the west. Perhaps it was located where Mystery Babylon is located. Perhaps not, but he has a close relationship with Mystery Babylon, so it could actually have been there. But somewhere to the west, and now he actually moves it to Jerusalem. And he kills the 2 witnesses. And he defiles the temple, declares himself to be God. He actually goes into the temple and declares himself to be God, and then requires all the world to worship him. Now that's where we left off last time. So, picking up here, we cover new material. What else he will also do at the midpoint of the tribulation is he will then turn against Mystery Babylon and destroy it. So in the first 3.5 years, there's this nice working relationship, but he is merely using Mystery Babylon, again, as a tool to help him achieve the power that he wants and gets to the place that he wants. When he is done with Mystery Babylon, he turns on it and betrays. That's in Revelation chapter 17, verses 16 and 17. If you look at Revelation 17, 16 and 17, it talks about the 10 horns. And the 10 horns here again would be that 10-nation confederation. These are the 10 kings that support him. We're told that back in verses 12 and 13 of chapter 17. So we know that these 10 horns are specifically 10 powers that support the Antichrist. Well, then when you get down here to verse 16 and 17, he says, and the 10 horns, again, the 10-nation confederation, which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore. The whore is Mystery Babylon, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. All right, so turning here upon, upon that mystery Babylon. So again, this is all a part of this major switch when all of a sudden his true colors really show as he breaks the covenant, invades Israel, now declaring himself to be God. He's done with mystery Babylon. You know, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future, but essentially mystery Babylon is a false religious system. So he will work with that false religious system until he's got where he wants and he's done with it. And you can see why he's going to destroy the false religious system at the midpoint, because it's at the midpoint that he's introducing a new religion. The new religion is, I'm God and you now worship me. There is no God but me. So the false religious system would be an apostate religious system that would acknowledge a God in heaven, would acknowledge Jesus Christ, but he now is going to turn on that apostate system. Of course, they won't believe in the biblical Jesus, but they'll acknowledge Jesus. They might claim to like the morals of Jesus and be followers of Jesus, but they'll be apostate. You know, they won't believe that he really was God in the flesh, for example, or maybe perhaps that he really rose from the dead type of thing. But they would claim to honor and esteem Jesus. But now, the Antichrist says, look, there's no talk of Jesus or anything else. We talk about me. And that's it. So that all goes together. When he invades Israel, he goes into the temple and declares himself to be God. At that same time, he's got these 10 nations that work with him to bring that false apostate religious system to an end. Because, like I said, he was merely using it. So it's a game. They probably thought that they were using the Antichrist, and the Antichrist knew he was using them. And in the end, it's the Antichrist who's going to come out on top of that deal. Right? So they think they're using this guy to get what they want, the power that they want in this false religious system. A lot of these false religions, of course, are really power plays in using religion. So that's a key event that happens at the midpoint of the tribulation period. And again, it's important to understand the dynamic of what is happening here. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Mystery Babylon going forward, but one common suggestion of the identity of this mysterious Babylon is that it is the United States. That it's a country like the United States. But you see, if you understand the bigger picture of what's happening, it doesn't make sense. No, it's a religious system. He wouldn't need to destroy the United States in order to declare himself God and require people to worship him. What we're seeing here is not a clash of his new religion versus a country, but of the old religious system versus the new one. The old one has to go to make room for the new one. So you can see, if you get the big picture, why it doesn't make sense to be identifying this with the United States here. All right, and then the next thing that he does at the midpoint is initiate the number 666. Of course, we talked about the significance of that number, that the Hebrew letters have numerical value, and for example, you could take the name Nero, and it adds up to 666, although other names could as well. And that's in Revelation 13, verses 16 through 18. So we've talked about that previously, and we'll come back to that again a little bit later. So we won't review that passage now, because like I said, we're going to come back to it again a little bit anyway. But that's when that happens. So we want to be clear that that is at the midpoint of the tribulation. He doesn't start out with that. We are in the middle of the tribulation when this happens. And so again, there was all kinds of internet talk. People talk about, the vaccine being the mark of the beast. It's like if the mark of the beast, we'd be in the middle of the tribulation period. The Antichrist would have invaded Israel, he would have killed the 2 witnesses, he would have gone into the temple. There is no temple over there, right? He would have gone into the temple and declared himself to be God. All of that. But that's an example of people not really understanding the data, just jumping in and pulling verses out of the Bible and trying to correlate it with current events. Okay? But not really having at all any understanding of the structure of the message. And that's why we kind of want to put these things in sequence, what he will do and when he will do it. And obviously, if you're clearly aware of this, that that's a midpoint of the tribulation thing, then you would look at that and say, well, obviously then a vaccine is not the mark of the beast. You might get, I don't know how many people were getting a shot at their forehead anyway, so and I don't know how you get a name or the number tied in with that, but maybe somehow, I don't know, it's in the fluid that they were injecting, I don't know. So there are a lot of complications with somehow making that the mark of the beast. But to get that in the mark of the beast, you've got to do a lot of loose reading and so forth. But, a lot of talk about that. People out there just trying to take something going on and then trying to correlate with the Bible. Next thing he will do at the midpoint is he will initiate the attempt to wipe out the Jews. Of course, it will be unsuccessful because God is going to preserve the Jewish nation. But this is in Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 17. Excuse me, verses 13 through 16. Revelation 12, 13 through 16. We'll do verse 17 in a moment, but verse 13 through 17. And when the dragon, Paul's here, that's the devil, we know that, again, this is a symbol that we know from Old Testament. You remember, the Old Testament is the lens through which we're interpreting. But verse 9 tells us specifically that that's who the dragon is. Back in verse 9, he told us that the dragon is the devil. The dragon is Satan. So we have this dragon that is the devil, and of course the devil is working through the Antichrist. We're told that when the dragon saw that he was cast into the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. Remember the first night we talked about this woman that gave birth to the child that was called to heaven, and we thought, who was that woman? And again, if you were just guessing, you might think, well, the woman gave birth to Jesus, so the woman might be Mary, but you'd be wrong, right? Because he's alluding to the Old Testament. The woman is actually the nation of Israel. So, this is not the devil persecuting Mary. Okay? Mary's up in heaven. She's safely in heaven, and she's been there for a long time. Okay? The devil's not going to be persecuting Mary. Right? This is the nation of Israel. Okay? So, this is Satan is persecuting Israel, the Jewish people who gave us the Messiah. Continuing on verse 14, and to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times, and half a time from the face of the serpent. Paul's here, the expression about time and half a time, again, is taken straight from the book of Daniel. It's Daniel's expression for a period of 3.5 years. You get 1 time, you get times dual, that's 2 times, and then a half time, for a total of 3.5 times. All right. 3.5 years. Okay, so the woman flees into the wilderness where God protects her and provides for her for 3.5 years. And why 3.5 years? Well, because again, this happens at the midpoint when he chases, when the Antichrist, or the devil, chases Israel, Israel flees and is hiding for the 3.5 years that constitute the second half of the tribulation period. So right up until the end, she is faithfully preserved. Verse 15, and the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon cast out of his mouth. So he tries to destroy the woman with a flood. Now, this is one of those cases where you might read it, you might wonder now when it says flood, is that talking about a literal flood? Because again, we know that Daniel was using a lot of symbolic language. What a lot of things he says, he means quite literally. Well, he's talking about a literal, is a flood going to come along in Israel and try to destroy the nation that the devil sends? I don't believe this is a literal flood. And in the Old Testament terminology, when armies come in and they just they just fill the land, they are often likened to a flood. So, for example, in Isaiah, where he is, the key passages that talk about the coming of the Messiah, chapter 6 through 12. Chapter 7, he tells us to be born of a virgin. Chapter 9, verse 6, one of the more famous verses in the Old Testament. Until as a child shall be born, until as a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders. But it's in passages that he talks about how the nation will be under the dominance of foreign powers, because, for example, the Assyrians would have come in like a flood, and they will flood Emmanuel's land. Okay. So just as the Assyrians in history flooded the land in the attempt to wipe out the Jewish people, but they didn't succeed because God preserved and protected them from the Assyrians. So in the end times, the devil is going to send a flood. I do not believe this is a literal flood. I think based on Old Testament usage, it is talking about massive military forces that he sends out to try to wipe out the Jews. But God hides them in the wilderness. Somehow or other, they're not able to get to them. The armies instead are getting killed and swallowed up in the wilderness while the Jews are being preserved and protected out there. And so that's the picture here. So it is unsuccessful. And Isaiah does talk about this event in particular as well, kind of a backdrop to understanding this passage. Look back at Isaiah chapter 26. Isaiah 26. Isaiah 26. Another name for Revelation is apocalypse. The apocalypse. That's really just the Greek word that means a revelation. So revelation is just the English word. Apocalypse is the Greek word. Isaiah chapters 24 through 27 are commonly referred to as the little apocalypse in the Bible, because Isaiah talks about the end times here. And so we're in the little apocalypse here in chapter 26. And look at verse 20 and down into chapter 27. Beginning with verse 20, it says, "Come, my people, enter thou into thy chambers, and shut thy doors about thee. Hide thyself, as it were, for a moment, until the indignation be overpast. For behold, the Lord cometh out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth also shall disclose her blood, and shall no more cover her slain. In that day the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, the crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea." Now you notice there are two key points of comparison here in Isaiah and Revelation 12. First of all, of course, you've got the dragon. This great and mighty dragon that is referenced chapter 27, verse 1. He's the crooked serpent, he's the dragon. That's what Revelation calls him. He's the dragon, he's the serpent, but then Revelation identifies who that dragon and who that serpent is. He says it's the devil. It's Satan. And eventually Satan is going to be destroyed by the Lord. The Lord is going to defeat him. So there's the reference to Satan, but back at the chapter 26, verses 20 and 21, notice how he talks about the Jews coming and hiding themselves for a short period while the Lord is judging the earth. And that's what's going to be happening during the last half of the 7 years. The Antichrist will initiate, like I said, this attempted genocide. The Jews will flee into the wilderness and hide, and God will safely protect them there. And so while, again, the devil was trying to do something bad that caused the Jews to flee into the wilderness, that's actually exactly what God wants. Once again, we find the devil, or the Antichrist, is nothing more than the pawn in God's hand, because God says, that's exactly where I needed Israel to be. I need them hiding safely in the wilderness, because the second half of the tribulation is going to get really bad. I'm going to really ramp up the judgments here, and I want them safely out of the way so that they won't be harmed and hurt. I don't want them dying by all these judgments I'm about to bring. So they'll be hiding safely in the wilderness. So God used the Antichrist to get his people exactly where he wants them. So he thinks he's hurting them, and all he's doing is he's just saying, okay, that's exactly where I wanted them to be anyway. So you're going to hide here safely until the indignation of the Lord be passed, which of course until the end of the tribulation period. Yes?
Is this referring specifically to the Jews of Israel?
Yes. When he says, "Come, my people," in the context, he's talking about the Jewish people here.
What about other Christians or Gentiles that say across the world?
They're not going to have that kind of supernatural preservation and protection. So this way you're going to find massive numbers of martyrs of the Christians.
So the only ones that will be protected, period, are going to be the Jews of Israel.
Yeah, they get that special protection because God wants them to survive until the end of the tribulation. He wants a lot of them alive still in their natural bodies.
So other than that area, all other Christians, saved people, going to die here.
We don't know that every single last one of them. There may be some that would live and survive, but many of them will die. There's no supernatural protection that's promised to them. So Maybe some might survive. The majority of them will presumably be killed.
There could be some Jew or Christians or Gentiles saved that are in with them, possibly.
Perhaps, and just by being with them. Yeah. But in general, the focus is the protection for the Jews. Back in Revelation 13, it specifically told us that God gives to the Antichrist the ability to kill the saints.
Oh,
It specifically says that God is going to allow him to kill the saints. But not the Jews. Of course, a lot of the Jews aren't even saved at this point. Remember, a great number of Jews are not going to get saved until the very end of the tribulation. So if they were to die, at this point, you'd have too many. Some Jews will die. They're not, elect. They're not destined to get saved. But a great number of the Jews are going to live and then end up getting saved right at the end when Christ returns. So he has to give them that preservation. But for the saved Gentiles, the plan doesn't require them to stay alive. So, but that leads us into, back in Revelation 12, if you look into Revelation chapter 12, we read through verse 16, where the devil, and again, we understand that he's doing this through the medium of the Antichrist, presumably, but I think that's a fair presumption that when it says the devil is doing this, that he's doing it because, again, we were explicitly told in chapter 13 that the beast, is empowered by the devil and so forth. But he then begins to persecute and kill Christians. Now, Christians have already been dying before the midpoint. In general, whatever world government and so forth is in place during the first half of the tribulation period, Christians aren't going to be liked by whoever's in power. But they're certainly not going to be liked by the Antichrist either. So when he has that position of power, he's going to go after them. And so chapter 12, verse 17 continues because he tries to get the Jews and can't. Verse 17 says, "And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ." Now I mentioned over in chapter 13, verse 7 explicitly does say that he's given power, to kill the saints. And obviously, we're talking about believers here. Again, many of the Jews aren't saints. They're elect, destined to get saved. So God is protecting them. But not Gentiles. We see, this is, John sees a heavenly vision, a great multitude from every kindred, nation, and tongue that end up as martyrs in heaven. And so we know that most of the Gentile believers are being killed. Now, the devil is going to step that up, again, presumably through the Antichrist. Basically, when he cannot kill the Jews, he is angry. So, well, if I can't kill the Jews, I'm going after the Christians. So when he says the remnant of her seed, that's an interpretational call, but most interpret it as a reference, again, to believers, to Christians. Because, again, if the woman represents Israel, who is safely protected, then it can't simultaneously be somebody that's not protected that he's able to go forth and kill. So most take that as a reference to just any believer, among the Gentiles. As Paul says in Galatians chapter 3, that those that are of faith are the children of Abraham. And there is a sense in which we are viewed as the spiritual heirs of Abraham if we are true believers. Okay? So we're not physical heirs, but we are viewed as the spiritual heirs. And so that's how this would be interpreted, that, okay, the devil can't get his physical descendants, but I'm going to go after the spiritual heirs of Abraham if I can't get the Jews. And God will let him kill, like I said, the Gentiles, because the plan doesn't require that they live, but he does need the Jews to survive. So is everybody clear on that? So again, all of that is initiated at the midpoint. So two things we want to be clear. A lot of Christians are going to be dying before this point. So we're not saying this is when Christians start dying. It is when they really specifically go after the Jews. Christians have been dying all along, but that would have been whatever power system is in place at that point that's killing them, and now it's the Antichrist going after them.
So who's doing this? Is this Satan doing this, or is this...
Well, it says Satan, but again, like I said, the following chapter makes it clear that it is really the devil who is empowering the beast. That's chapter 13, verse 4.
The beast is Antichrist.
The beast is the Antichrist, yeah. And so, with that explicit statement that the devil is empowering the Antichrist, the two are kind of viewed as inseparable, that the devil is simply doing it through the medium of the Antichrist. Because again, if there are armies, like with the flood represents armies, well, that's a physical medium that the devil is using. mean, you could interpret that literally that the devil sends a flood. Well, like I say again, I'm going to interpret it through the lens of Old Testament terminology and take that as symbolic language along with the other symbols in this chapter. Yeah.
Where does the false prophet fit in all of this?
Well, we're getting to him next.
Okay.
That was a perfect timing for the question.
That was
So,
a setup.
but we got just a little bit more to do with the Antichrist, and then we're going to get to him. Yeah.
I mean, when you get the last part of the verse, it does seem to represent more the Christians. But when I was reading the first part of the verse, I was almost thinking it was the nation as a whole that was dispersed and hidden, and it was the remnants of throughout the world of like your Jews that are in Russia that couldn't get back, or the ones that couldn't get to the. But then it does look to be more the actual saved because it has testimony of Jesus Christ. But I was wondering if it could be some of the remnant also of just the scattered Jews that don't make it. Now I remember reading some of the other stuff. I'm trying to think, my brain comes up with. The woman, don't grab your stuff or run to the hills. Like some people will be left and they will catch the persecution because they were like, they dilly dally.
Well, they were left because they probably weren't going to be saved, right?
Yeah, well, like as the United States, if they're Jews, they would be saved Jews.
Yeah.
But the point is there are a lot of unsaved Jews.
But there's a
that
lot of
they
the Jews as a nation is protected. They run, and then God is protecting them as a nation. There's a lot of Jews kind of scattered throughout the world that are unprotected, unsaved, and he turns, well, I can't get the
Right.
ones, I'm going to go after the ones I can get, the ones.
Right. But the point is, again, a lot of those Jews aren't saved yet. So again, if you're talking some Jews in Russia, the fact that he specifically characterized not
That's
some of
testimony.
them, right, not some of the remnant have kept the testimony and some haven't. He seems to describe the remnant all as those that keep the testimony. In other words, by remnant of her seed, he's referring to people who are all believers. And so that wouldn't seem to be just other Jews that are living elsewhere in the world, because again, many of those Jews would not yet be believers at this point. Many of them aren't going to become believers until right at the very end when Jesus returns. And so, I mean, I suppose someone wanted to try to, but I really think that that's missing the point, because he's making it clear here he's going after believers. So the first part would seem to be, I'm going after ethnic Israelites, many of whom are not even saved. The majority of them still at this point, probably not even saved. The latter half of the verse, I'm going after saved people, as opposed to somebody based on his nationality.
Christ.
Yeah, based on his relationship with Christ
There
first.
you go.
So it's that kind of, well, if I can't get the Jews, I'm going to get the Christians. It would be his, seem to be the way to read that. And so he is throwing up, and again, this is written of Antiochus Epiphanes. Remember, when Daniel tells us in Daniel chapter 11, it's a similar type thing, that he goes down to attack Egypt. He wants to take over Egypt. Remember, this is where the Egyptian king hires the Romans to come help. And so they double team him, and so he does not succeed in that battle. He loses. And because he loses, he's mad. So on his way back home to Syria, he throws a temper tantrum in Israel and persecutes the Jews. It's just the type of thing that he does. Well, if I can't get what I want, then I'll take it out on somebody else. And it's like it's the same thing. What Daniel 11 said about Antiochus, the guy who attacks other people just because he didn't get what he wanted. It's that type of thing again. Well, I can't get the Jews. Well, then I'll go get the Christians. Just because. What I really wanted were the Jews, but I'll kill the Christians just because I can. And God won't let me get the Jews type of thing. All right, well, we move on to the very end of his power, which is at the end of the tribulation period, right at the very end. And real simple, he is cast into hell, alive into hell. That's chapter 19. Chapter 19, this is where Jesus comes back. And we might do well to kind of get the account of his return, and then we see how the Antichrist comes into the picture. So chapter 19, pick up with verse 11 and following. Chapter 19, verse 11 and following. He says, And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. And his eyes were as a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns, and he had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the fowls that fly in the midst of heaven, Come and gather yourselves together unto the supper of the great God, that ye may eat the flesh of kings and the flesh of captains, and the flesh of mighty men, and the flesh of horses, and of them that sit on them, and the flesh of all men, both free and bond, both small and great. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth, and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his army. Paul's here, I saw the beast, again, that's the Antichrist, as well as other kings of the earth. That's because they're all there in Israel fighting the battle of Armageddon when Jesus returns. So they're all gathered together. So you have not only the Antichrist in this case, but all the other kings of the earth leading their armies, and they were all there at the battle of Armageddon. Again, fighting to take over Israel and trying to kill the Jews and take over the land. They all want Israel for themselves. Boy, isn't that crazy? A tiny little piece of real estate, what a country put the size of Delaware, and the whole world wants it. It's like there's all this land, and you want that tiny little strip of land there.
But the Jews have run up into the hills and the mountains, correct?
Yeah, but they will come out right at the very end, and they're fighting for the land, for the nation. So God has preserved them to the end, but now they're fighting. And they fight for what I believe is 10 days, and then Jesus returns. So the battle is going on for 10 days, and they fought valiantly, but they're outnumbered. They can't quite do it. So Jerusalem is half captured. We know that from Zechariah 14. That Jerusalem half falls to the enemy. At this point, Jesus comes. And what verse 19 is telling us is that when Jesus comes, they change their focus from fighting to get the land to fighting against Jesus. So it's like, this is kind of the weirdest thing. Jesus comes from heaven, all these armies follow him out of heaven. It's like, seriously? And they start, what are you turning your guns and you're pointing, I don't know, what artillery you can shoot up into the air, and I guess they're going to send fire juts up into the air and try to, it's the craziest thing, how all that will pan out, but we're just told that they're going to turn their attention to fighting against Jesus. So they're all there, but the focus of the battle just instantly changes. Well, I was fighting for this, but now I'm just fighting against Jesus, just because I hate him that much. It's like, I wanted the land, but there's something I want more than that. And that is to satisfy my hatred against Jesus. Which, again, don't you actually see people like that in the world today? I mean, they hate Jesus more than they love anything else, as their hatred is greater than their love. And so, at all costs, we've got to do away with Jesus. So that's what happens. So then we get to verse 20, and the beast, again, that is our Antichrist, was taken, and with him the false prophet. See, there's our false prophet. And with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, and with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. And the remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their flesh. So all these armies are all killed by Jesus, but there are two individuals who are not killed by Jesus when he returns. That is the Antichrist and the false prophet. He does not kill them. Verse 20 tells us that instead he cast them alive into the lake of fire. And the designation lake of fire is the designation for the final eternal place of punishment, not temporary place of punishment. Of course, we've just been talking about that in Sunday school, right? You've got the temporary place of punishment, Hades, until we get to the final place of punishment, and we hadn't gotten to that yet in Sunday school, but we've been talking about the temporary place. But the designation lake of fire is always a reference to the ultimate final destiny of the devil and of all unsaved people. And these two are cast into that final ultimate place. They would appear to be the first two people ever actually to go to hell proper. The Antichrist and the false prophet. I mean, they make it there before the devil does. The devil's not crawled in there yet. They are literally the first two people to go to hell. Hell proper. Like I said again, about Sunday school, a lot of people, and then Hades, temporary place of punishment. But this is the final place, and they're the first two to go there. God kind of reserves that honor for them, and He casts them in there, alive. Now, of course, everybody who ends up in hell will end up there bodily. They'll be resurrected in their bodies. So everyone who ends up in hell, there are no souls in hell. There are souls in Hades, the temporary place. There will be no souls in hell. I mean, there's souls, but they're souls in bodies. No one's walking around as a spirit in hell. They're all in their bodies. So, again, this is not unusual that they're cast alive in the lake of fire. Everyone who's cast into the lake of fire is going to be cast into it alive. But most of those people will die and have to be resurrected. These people won't have to be resurrected. So presumably their body will undergo that transformation that allows them again to, or however God works it, that allows them to just continue to exist and without, again, being consumed in the flames.
One of them's already died once anyway.
Yeah, that's true. You're right, the Antichrist would have already died because he is a resurrected individual. Yeah. Now, Andy, you had a question here?
Yeah, so the Antichrist is resurrected by God, not the devil, right?
It doesn't say who resurrects them. It could be the devil, but by God's permission, ultimately. Just like, it says that it was given unto him to kill the saints and make war. All of
I
it.
guess the bigger question is, who chooses him as the Antichrist? Is it the devil that chooses him as the Antichrist, or does God choose him as the Antichrist?
The Bible never explicitly says, and again, we're kind of back to saying ultimately God does, because He's sovereignly controlling everything. But again, is the devil really just doing God's bidding, thinking that he's working against God? It's like, you picked exactly the guy I wanted. It could be that way. Like I said, when He chases Israel in the wilderness, God says, good, that's exactly where I needed them. So could it be that the devil's picking, say, Antiochus, and it's like, well, that's really who God wanted to pick all along. So I presume that the devil is the one that's going to be resurrecting him.
Kind of like Saul, when Saul was looking for a donkey or whatever, it was his free will, but it was exactly what,
Yeah.
it still, He gave him the will, but He
Right.
already knew the whole thing.
But yet somehow, he's doing exactly what God wanted.
God's will.
So again, that's an incredible amount of power, though, that God is allowing the devil, if you think about it, that God is actually allowing the devil, if it's the devil, because it doesn't say actually who resurrects him, only that he comes out, from Hades. But presumably the devil, but that's a tremendous power that God is going to grant him to be able to
He takes
resurrect
credit
him.
for it. He takes credit for it.
Yeah. And technically in theology, we make a distinction between what we call a revivification of a body and a resurrection. Technically in theology, revivification is what happened to Lazarus. He came back, but he was still in a mortal body and he just died again. And that's what's going to happen to the Antichrist. That'll be a mortal body. Resurrection is what happened to Christ. He didn't just come back. He came back in an immortal body that cannot die. And so technically, but we use the word resurrection in an untechnical way many times in conversation. Okay. But I'm just saying, technically, resurrection means glorified body, revivification. So just to be clear, when we say the Antichrist again, that the devil will resurrect him. The devil won't give him a glorified body. That's the power of God. He can merely revivify him, but he can't give him.
But he won't die again.
Right, but that's presumably because, like the false prophet, whatever happened, and what's happening to all these, that God is going to work that transformation, whatever, that causes them not to die. All right, so that's his end. So he does come to an end. Now, of course, we were introduced, as we said here, to the false prophet. So let's turn our attention into the false prophet because he is another key character in the end times prophecy. Chapter 13 in Revelation is where pretty much we find everything we know about him, other than, as we just saw here in chapter 19, he pumps back up and we see his end, that he meets his end along with the Antichrist. But other than that, chapter 13 is all we know about him. If we didn't have Revelation 13, we wouldn't even know there was going to be a false prophet. That's one of the entirely new piece of information that John gives in Revelation. It just didn't pop up anywhere in the Old Testament. So the Old Testament does talk about the Antichrist a number of times, but it never says anything about the false prophet. Billy?
Yeah, just look at past that last slide. Why do you capitalize H and L?
Why do I do that? I just it's a place and the name of a place. I mean, a lot of people don't. I don't think there's a specific.
Like Greenville, you just, I mean, it's a proper noun, so
Yeah, like Greenville.
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
A lot of times you see the word heaven is not capitalized.
Yeah, I tend to capitalize it because I think of it as the name of a place, but a lot of times it's not capitalized.
So hell time.
And there may be technically, technical proper grammar may be that, it's not to be capitalized, but I'm going to ignore that in that case because I see heaven as a place, and that's what we call it, so I capitalize it. Yeah. I do the same thing with pronouns for that refer to deity. Again, technically they will tell us you don't capitalize, like the H and his, even if you're referring to Jesus, it's still just a small. I always capitalize the H that refers to Jesus. To me, it's just a matter of, setting him apart. I mean, I just do that anytime I write. Just my own personal notes. If I'm doing, sermon notes, and I refer to Jesus, it's going to be a capital H, so.
Sometimes S and Satan.
Yeah, because that is viewed as like a proper name. It wasn't there originally, but it becomes one. So in the book of Job, he's actually called the Satan. But Job was very, and that's very early, but that designation, the definite article drops off, and over time, it actually becomes his name. Because Satan just means like an adversary. So the Satan is literally how it says in the Hebrew Job. But the Jews eventually just started calling him Satan like a name. So yeah, we capitalize it. So, chapter 13, then, like I said in Revelation, is where we find everything we know about the false prophet. And the story of the false prophet begins in verse 11. Verse 11. So, the first half of the chapter is describing the Antichrist. And we gleaned out of this chapter some of the key things we know about him. Or declare himself to be God. And we'll go after the saints to kill them. When we get to verse 11, he now introduces to us another beast. Remember, the Antichrist, and his kingdom is called a beast. But verse 11 says, I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. So we get this other beast, and as we continue on, you'll see it's false prophet, why we call him a false prophet. And of course, again, chapter 19, we see that where he pops up again. But in terms of his identity, possibly a Jew. Can't say 100% for sure, but I'd say it's a good possibility because of where he comes from. He comes up out of the earth, or you could translate that out of the land. That Greek word can be translated as earth, it can be translated as land, and often it would be land, and the land that is talked about is the land of Israel. The land becomes, an expression for Israel, is the land. Which would have him being Jewish. Now this stands in contrast to the Antichrist, whose origins and background comes out of the sea. Look at chapter 13, verse 1, where the Antichrist and the kingdom that he's a part of is introduced to us. He says, I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea. So the first beast, the Antichrist, comes up out of the sea. This beast comes up out of the land. So the text is actually going out of its way to stress that they have different origins. Land, like I said in the Bible, usually represents Israel. By contrast, sea then represents everything that's not Israel, which would be the Gentile nations. And so, for example, if you want to jump ahead for a moment to chapter 17, verse 5, verse 15. In chapter 17, verse 15, an example where, again, he's going to really identify what water represents in Revelation. So we don't even have to guess here. It's a different chapter, but again, it's water. And it's water that's associated with that beast again. He says, and he said unto me, the waters which thou sawest, where the horse sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So here we have water, and again, water that, if you read earlier in the chapters, associated with that same beast, and he specifically tells us the water represents the nations, plural, multitudes and nations and kindreds and tongues. So presumably, based on the fact that the expression land commonly in the Bible refers to the land of Israel, based on this specific interpretation of water as representing Gentile nations, then again, it would seem to be telling us that the Antichrist comes from the West. He's a Westerner, presumably a Gentile, again, like Nero or Antiochus Epiphanes, a Gentile. But then the Antichrist, the false prophet, would be a Jew. So a traitor to his own people. There have always been plenty of traitors. So nothing to go about that.
George Soros.
Well, George Soros being a good example of one. Yeah, if we weren't so old, maybe, but it's getting pretty up there.
The son's probably as bad as his.
But I mean, he represents them. I mean, that's the kind of people there are. So perhaps a Jew. Moving on, verse 12 through the first part of verse 14. 12 to 14, we're told, and he exercises all the power of the first beast, that is the Antichrist, before him, and causes the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And he doth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast. So he has the power to work miracles. Verse 14 specifically refers to miracles. Verse 13 refers to wonders. One of the wonders that he does is he makes fire come down from heaven. Satan, of course, is always an imitator. Remember that Elijah called fire down from heaven. And now the false prophet is going to call fire down from heaven. And while certainly technology will play a role in the end times, as it does in our life, in our lives now, what the false prophet is doing is not smoke and mirrors. The text is very clear about this. This is not technology. So for all the technology that we have, what the false prophet is doing is he's not deceiving people with technology. It explicitly tells us that he does wonders and miracles. I take that very literally. A miracle is a miracle. Right? So he is overriding the rules of nature and the laws that God, the normal laws that God has put in place that govern the universe. And again, that would be by the power of Satan. And again, I think I referenced on the previous night, just as Pharaoh's magicians literally turned their rods into serpents. That was a miracle. It was a miracle when Moses' rod became a serpent. It was also a miracle when Pharaoh's magicians turned their rods into serpents. And the text says that that's what they did. There is no rational explanation of how a rod becomes a serpent. If you take the text of Exodus at face value, it's telling you they did a miracle. It's not telling you they did a magic trick. So God gave them the power to do that. Well, he's going to really step it up for the purpose of the end time. So we are going to see the false prophet doing some pretty incredible miracles. So verse 14 says he's able to deceive them by means of those miracles. So again, the Antichrist is proclaiming himself to be God, and his prophet is forcing the rest of the world to worship him, and he does all these miracles that supposedly authenticate that. And again, God allows that. 2 Thessalonians 2 specifically says God allows that because these people didn't want the truth, so he's allowing them to be deceived by these miracles. The next thing we know then is that he requires the world to worship the image of the Antichrist. That's the second half of verse 14 down through verse 15. So picking up where we left off in verse 14, after come out doing the miracles, it says, saying to them that dwell in the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword and did live, and he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. So here is where it specifically references this image now that he commands them to make. Image of the beast that is reminiscent of when King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of himself back in Daniel chapter 2. It required everybody to worship that image. Well, here makes an image And then he requires everybody to, again, to worship the image of the beast. So you worship the Antichrist, or you worship his image. Now, the text does not explicitly state this, but if we have an image of the beast, it's very likely that the image will probably be placed in the Jewish temple. Now, Paul explicitly tells us that the Antichrist will go into the temple and proclaim himself to be God. I'm guessing that likely, in association with that event or as a follow-up, the image is put in there and remains in there. You know, the Antichrist isn't going to live there, but the image will go there. But then he does this incredible miracle that he causes the image of the beast that it should live here, that it's able to speak. So this is a pretty incredible miracle again. Verse 15, he had power to give life unto the image of the beast.
You think it's true life, or an image that was robotic, that had the,
Well,
or a
again,
combination of the two?
you know, good brother could disagree. If you wanted to read it a little bit loosely, you might say this is first century way of saying that he was able to animate this thing. And what is it that's animating it? Well, perhaps technology. Like I said, technology is going to play a significant role in the end times. But given the fact that we were just told that he has the ability to perform wonders and miracles, and he's doing the real stuff, and 2 Thessalonians 2 again tells us he's doing real miracles. I think it's very possible it means quite literally that not simply that it's being animated by technology, but that this thing is animated by some kind of, non-physical like technology.
Clone.
Yeah, in an inexplicable way, that it comes to life. I don't know of any place in the Bible that says the devil can't do that. He can give a sort of life. I've often heard people say, well, only God can create life. It's like, I don't know of any verse that says that. I don't know of any verse in the Bible that says only God can create life. Now, it's likely that only God can create a mortal life and a kind of glorified life that we get. That specifically is said in the Bible that, that
What
comes
is
from
it?
the
I
Holy
mean,
Spirit.
when they were doing the sheep and they cloned something, I mean, it's not life, but it is life. It's not real life.
Right.
So
And they're kind of
they
making it in the
cloned
lab and so forth. Well, it might be some,
I mean,
maybe
that is
something like
life in a way, but it's not a soul. It's not a real.
Yeah. Yeah, and there might be some weird combination. The transhumanist, well, what that weird guy was the first night we walked to, the really weird Jewish guy. That's kind of what they call transhumanism. They kind of the merging of machine and man together. So, there is a push for that type thing. Maybe that's kind of what this is. It's it's an image that it's a machine, but then it actually kind of is. Who knows? Again, we just don't have enough information what John means when he talks about being animated. But it also speaks again as well. And again, so there could be a spiritual element to that. Some could see it as technology, but I think it's more than just technology. Technology may play some role, but I think there's something above and beyond that, because this is put in the
But
context
the
of the
other
spirit
is,
working
if
power.
you did have something like that, or an image, you could have a demonic spirit possess it.
Yeah, something more like that. And I think that would be more convincing to people. If it's something that people could look at and say, boy, that's a pretty good robot. They've got, how good they've gotten with these robots. That's not really going to impress people. One gets the sense again that what he's doing here is very impressive. So I'm thinking that it's the type of thing that they would look at and be absolutely amazed that they could do this. That the false prophet. Again, it's the false prophet who does this. This isn't mankind, and while look what we have been able to achieve. This is specifically something that the false prophet is said to do. Now, he tells them to make it, but then he's the one that makes it come to life. So it is an interesting, kind of an interesting record here. You make it, I'll make it come to life.
Why do they need to make an image of the Antichrist? Isn't he still there? Is he off?
Yeah, he's still there, but you know how it is. I mean, all these dictators want to, go to North Korea, and every living room you got to have a picture of Kim Jong-il, right? And you got to have his image everywhere. They always have that kind of thing.
I'm with you.
Yeah. Georgia.
So the false prophet will be human. He will be.
Yeah, he will be human.
He won't be somebody like the Antichrist that's coming
Right.
from.
Yes. Yeah. We're never told, but he's a
And
resurrected.
he'll get his power from.
But he'll get his power from the devil.
Okay.
So he would be a normal human, but, satanically possessed, demon possessed. Yes. Clearly he would be demon possessed, or, that's it, the Antichrist would be like possessed by Satan himself, and then a high level demon possessing the false prophet. Yeah.
Well, this is what the people don't want, Jesus, so he's giving them, I assume, some worship.
Yes, it's often been observed, we said earlier, how he's the imitator of God. And so you have kind of what they call a false trinity. People often refer to it as that, because you've got the three that we find here. Because you've got the devil, who would be kind of like the equivalent of the Father, and then the Antichrist, obviously, the opposite of Christ, and then the false prophet, who feels like a Holy Spirit role, the role of the Holy Spirit to convict and to testify to people of truth. And the Holy Spirit, Jesus said, He come and He won't speak Himself, say what He's told, and He'll speak of me. And that's exactly what you see here. So you've got the devil from the role of the Father, you've got the false Christ, and then you've got this false prophet who fills kind of a Holy Spirit kind of a role. So it's like a false trinity. It's not all the real trinity, because those are each separate and distinct individuals. But it's, the devil can't be what God is, but it's, has that kind of imitation. So, yes, we've got him then requiring the world to worship him. And then, finally, this is where we get to 666 again. And technically, we talk about the Antichrist introducing 666. I kind of referenced earlier with him that's at the midpoint, because I wanted to kind of give you the timing on that, the midpoint. But it's technically, again, that technically is coming from the false prophet. So if you look at verses 16 through 18, notice again it says, He, at the beginning of verse 16, still talking about the false prophet. He causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is the wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it's the number of a man, and his number is 666. Notice how verse 16 says that it's the false prophet who causes everybody actually to take that mark in their right hand or in their forehead there. But he's working in cahoots with the Antichrist. That's why loosely we can say the Antichrist introduces that. But technically, again, that's his right-hand man doing that. Like, Hitler had his Goebbels, right, his propaganda guy. And so the Antichrist has him, and he's kind of drawing all the attention to him. And it requires everyone to have the 666, which again is specifically honoring the Antichrist. You have to recognize him, because again, the number represents him. So in verse 17 talks about that you have to take the mark, and this is a little unclear the way it's translated here in English, especially in the King James. But and there are two ways you could translate, two possibilities. That number one, the mark comes in two different forms. So we always talk about the 666, but you could actually get his name. So in other words, you get the mark in the form of his name, or the mark in the form of a number. So you might get 666, or you might just go with his name. So that's one way you could translate it, that it comes in two forms. The other way is that, no, it's just the number 666, because that word "or" there actually can, it's a less common use of the Greek word, but it can be translated as like, when you say "that is." So in other words, you can translate it like this, that, you have to have the mark, the name of the beast, that is the number of his name. So you have to have his name, that is the number, in which case it would say only the number. So again, it's an interpretational call, so some think it comes only in one form, 666. Others are going to read it as take your choice. So not everyone necessarily will go around with 666 plastered on their foreheads. It might be just the Antichrist's actual name spelled out. But yeah, that's that typical dictator thing taken to new heights, and everybody has to actually get his name, right, plastered right on. You got to worship him, and you got to take his name on you, and so forth. So he's a pretty arrogant fellow. The Bible stresses much of his arrogance, so that kind of, again, God uses that and just plays it into fulfilling his plans. So that's it for the false prophet. So that's really all that we know about him as he makes his appearance in the book of Revelation. But then you would kind of go, well, he actually plays a pretty big role in the end times, even though he doesn't pop up a lot. What's here let you know what role he plays. And again, I just think it's interesting that he is a Jew, likely selling out his own people. All right. Any other questions about this? Yeah.
Does he have 6 digits on his hand?
I don't.
He does, on that picture.
Probably not, but that would be interesting if he did, huh?
That picture does.
Yeah, the 666. So that's why you're asking me. I thought you were just wanting me to ask that, but because of the picture. Yeah.
Well, he could have 3.
I mean, there are people that have 6 fingers, so it's possible. So I had a brother that had 6 fingers on each hand. So.
I think that Princess Bride movie, the villain had 6 digits.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I didn't know
Man
that.
with 6 fingers.
Yeah, the kid was looking for a man with 6 digits.
With 6 fingers. I forgot what 6 fingers.
Did he have it just on one hand?
Did he spam 666 on people?
Yeah, maybe there was some prophetic significance there. And so, okay, you know. All right, well, we're going to wrap it up here then. So that's the Antichrist and the false prophet. Lord willing, next time we'll talk about his kingdom, what the key things we know about his kingdom that was set up. And just kind of spoiler alert, you probably already know this, but again, it would be a revived empire. So this is the Antichrist, somebody who's been in this world before. His empire is going to be revived as well. They revived Roman Empire.
This comes after the beast has been thrown in that lake on, or are they simultaneous? The beast,
The beast said.
That's at the very end of the tribulation period.
that, okay.
That
This
they're thrown
is,
into.
okay, so you're kind of going
We
back
move
in
back.
time, and these are.
Right, now I back up to the false prophet. Right? We went through in sequence of the Antichrist, and then I kind of backed up to the...
So they're both on the scene. This-
Right, at this point. And this is all midpoint of the tribulation again, but then kind of dominates. In other words, it's a midpoint that he initiates 666 and makes the image, and then that image stays in there for the whole last 3.5 years. That's until Christ returns. Right. And that's why that's introduced, like, for example, in chapter 13. Chapter 13, we're at the midpoint. It's introduced then because that's when he initiates it, and then it kind of continues through the last 3.5 years. So, all right. Well, listen, next time we'll talk a little bit more about that kingdom and why we think it's a revived Roman Empire. But let's have a word of prayer.